Hey guys, it's MC Darvel. Thanks for tuning in again. Today we've got a little bit of a longer video. So I spent about 6 hours, not including the original sketch, working on this comic page. This is page 20 in the debut comic that my friend Addie and I are working on. So let's get rolling with the time lapse. So you probably noticed already, I'm speaking more slowly. I'm trying to speak in a more relaxed manner. I essentially want to make this the type of video that is relaxing and something you could fall asleep to. I do like to watch some YouTubers who have that kind of combination of drawing plus relaxation. So let's talk about what's going on in this page. This is a page full of action. We have, in the panel you see I'm working on there, our main character. Her name is Vigil. We sometimes call her by her nickname Trench. She has just fallen off the side of a train that she happened to try to land on because these other villains who she's been chasing in the previous pages ended up doing a little bit of a stunt and landing on top of this train. So certainly lots of suspense and drama. The guy with the plague mask, his name is, well, Plague. He is kind of a jerk. Obviously, he's a bad guy. And what he's gonna do here is at first realize that, whoa, she is actually still hanging on to the train. Gotta do something about that. So he runs up to this motorcycle that was left by another villain who is no longer with us. And he's gonna very cheekily kick it over to her and try to force her off the side of the train. So that's the story setup. Right here I'm drawing the incinerated or burnt hand of that dearly departed other villain, who I'm sure I can show in other drawing videos in the future. You'll notice I found that hand sticking out to be a little bit distracting, or confusing is probably the better term. So I got rid of it. This train is going through a tunnel. I modeled this train off the SEPTA train that I would ride in Philadelphia when I lived there. It goes both underground and overground. So, like I said, I started out with a preliminary sketch, and I'm just drawing over it with a very solid, fat line. My reason for using this very solid, fat line with very minimal line variation, line weight change. In fact, you might even say 0 line weight variation, is that I don't want the lines to take on any special significance. I want them to work with the watercolor that I do eventually. A lot of comic book art, especially, well, I wouldn't say especially Western comic art, I would say even manga, heavily emphasizes rendering with line weight, hatching, in manga, screen tones are a big thing. I do like screen tones myself, but I don't really use them anymore. What I'm saying is there's a lot of emphasis on detail coming from the line art. And that's perfectly fine. It looks very good, I think. But I made a compromise in my style. I find it easier to not do the rendering with line art, but to give the illusion of detail in the later steps of rendering with watercolor. Here I'm putting in some solid blacks because though I do the watercolor to give the sensation of detail, I still like to look at the line art, and I think the line art itself on its own looks better with these solid blacks. So I'm going to take pauses from time to time and just let the music play. And when there's something to talk about, come back and talk about it. So this is a good time to pick back up. Now clearly I'm getting into the quote-unquote coloring phase, as you notice from the finished picture that I showed. There's no color, and I'm not going to color this myself, probably. Maybe might not even color it at all. I don't know. For a very long time, even up to recently, really, didn't like color in comic books. I wish I could explain why. It's just a simple fact. I know I'm not alone in that. Some people will look at the original art, the pencils, even adding the inks with the rendering I've been discussing, and look at that without color and say, I like it better. I don't know. Marvel and DC release versions of their comic books, or the more popular ones, that have no color, that are essentially just the original pencil art with speech bubbles added. I've seen one for one of David Finch's Batman runs. I recently saw one for one of Greg Capullo and Scott Snyder's Batman runs, The Court of Owls. And I mean, it just looks better. Oh, well, I don't know. I really do like the color, actually, in Court of Owls. And that might be one of the first times I found myself saying, wow, I actually like this. Anyway, point is, this may or may not be colored, and I'm not worried if it's not, because I think grayscale looks great. I've mentioned Akira, the manga, by Katsuhiro Otomo before, and I won't even bother looking at the colored version. No offense to the colorist of that. The grayscale version is far superior in my opinion. There was no need to color it. Anyway, I'll give you a sense of why I'm not worried about color. So clearly I've started watercoloring, and my process is to go through with this magic wand tool and select the areas that will be their own layer to color over. And this is an easy way. Just select them, make them their own layer, fill them in with some value. Here I'm doing a light gray. And then when you're ready to render with, whatever you're going to render with, in my case watercolor, just lock the pixels on that layer with the lock button, and I think this is a feature on almost all sketching platforms. Lock that layer and then start your rendering, and the rendering will only happen to the pixels on that layer. The pixels that have something, some value to them, not empty pixels. So this is a pretty quick and easy way to get your rendering done, or your coloring. You can do coloring this way. Here I want sort of the glow from the interior leaking out of the windows of this train to really light up the front of Trench here. Later on, I'm going to be just copy and pasting the image of Trench and mirroring it so you can see a reflection of her in that window. So there's going to be a little bit of watercoloring here. Let me talk about environment and atmosphere. Hopefully you can see from this that I've put a lot of emphasis on both of those aspects. By environment, I simply mean I'm making sure it does seem like these characters are in this environment. And to do that, I've paid close attention to proportion and perspective, and of course, composition. You can see that the characters look like they belong there because their relative sizes make sense given the perspective that is being enforced by these multiple lines receding into the distance. There are several aspects to this drawing that I think make it, or give it, variety. And those aspects are, for instance, having several different zooms, several different camera angles, and making sure at least one or two panels zoom in very close for reactions. Now, if all of the panels were featured the characters in the same relative proportions and perspective, it might be a little boring. You'll notice that the two panels in the middle row are the same field of view. Let's say that. Nearly the same field of view. Different angles, but similar field of view. Now, for example, if I had kept that field of view, or in other words, that zoom for every panel, it would look a little stiff, stilted. So, I included variety by making sure to have several different fields of view. And of course, the number one thing is that the information you want to convey is conveyed in an efficient way. That's not always the easiest thing to do. I'm not always successful. I'd say I'm more generally successful than I am good at picking the best layout or composition for a given story, for each panel, for a given panel, that is. That's just to say, I'm still not an expert at optimizing the composition for each panel, but it's an extremely important aspect of the comic making process, and I do try to give it its due attention. Now, the watercolor affords a lot of variety in itself, especially for, as I've mentioned, adding a sense of detail. The texture there really gives a more grounded feeling to the environment. The texture of the watercolor, that is. I find watercolor texture to be very, very pleasant to look at. And watercolor might be my favorite medium, just to look at and to watch people use. And it might be the only traditional medium that I can somewhat use. Digitally, I think it's much easier to use than traditionally. That's probably true for any digital technique. Here I'm adding some lights just to, enhance the feeling of being inside a dark train tunnel. Getting a little bit of detail. I find that I can have a very efficient and effective process by only having an inking layer and a layer an overlay layer usually for highlights, and this would go above almost every other layer except for, well, sometimes above the ink layer too. It depends. If I don't want the ink to stand out in the lighting, I'll have that layer, that overlay or lighting layer above the ink. And there are a couple of examples of that in this drawing. But for the most part, I like the ink to be the topmost layer. Until, of course, I get to the speech bubbles, and then those will be on the top. And speaking of speech bubbles, you didn't see it in the initial sketch, but there's a version that exists of the initial sketch where I do lay out where the speech bubbles are going to go. And I do recommend doing that beforehand, because you don't want to find yourself in the situation where after you've rendered and made this page that you're proud of. You don't want to have the situation where you have to change a panel or two because you didn't make any room for the speech bubble. Probably every comic book artist, amateur and expert alike, have been in this situation, and it's no fun. So make room for those speech bubbles. Here, if you haven't noticed, there's a fire burning behind that one bike that he kicks, and I make that essentially pure white surrounded by a dark aura, which is like smoke. And that fire is used to define the lighting in this page, which is nice because it helps to cast shadows, which brings some definition to the drawing, and obviously atmosphere. So, let me know if you like this kind of video. I know it's on the longer side, but I'm hoping it's relaxing and just something maybe you could have on in the background and look at from time to time. Let me know if you'd be interested in having the full version of this. I could put it up on Discord. I could offer them up on Gumroad for a very reasonable price. Let me know. So plans for this channel going forward. This is, I think, my third video at this point, and I'm still trying to figure out where this channel fits in the drawing YouTube community as a whole, and tried to find the niche, I guess. And if you have any suggestions or constructive criticism or whatever, that would very, very much help to hear your thoughts in the comments. But I'm going to be doing probably more of these comic pages, and I think one of my endeavors or videos that I'll try to get out pretty soon is a commentary with my writer / editor on going from cradle to grave, as it were, from writing a comic book page all the way to rendering and adding the speech bubbles and completing the page, and talk about our process. We often go back and forth. I'll do a little bit of work, send him the work I've done, and he'll have usually very helpful suggestions, which I can implement the next day or whenever I can pick it up again. And I think that kind of feedback loop is very helpful, and I'd like to explain why I find it helpful. And to show you how work with feedback. I think it's very important for artists, or really anybody, to understand how to respond to feedback. If you've never heard of the YouTuber and amazing artist Trent Kaniuga, it's Kaniuga, highly recommend going to check out his channel, especially if you're interested in both, very nice comic and concept design type art, but maybe more so a lot of advice and shared experience of somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, because he sure has, and a lot of experience and a lot of good advice on being a professional artist, what it's like. And so I highly recommend going to check out his channel. Now, I'm not a professional artist by any means. Not a professional comic book artist. I think my main goal of starting this channel and working on it is to hopefully, number one, improve by getting feedback, and of course to hopefully make a name for myself, try to break in, and I don't necessarily mean I want to work for a publisher. I think at this point I'd be more interested in being my own publisher. But that means I've got to do all of the PR work, I've got to do all of the marketing. That's kind of what this channel is for. So, any sort of feedback, criticism that you, my viewers, can give me is going to be invaluable to me, and I'm really going to take that criticism and improve with it. So, if you don't like this video, give it a thumbs down. I'm perfectly fine with that. I would appreciate it if you could take a little bit of time and explain why, but if you can't, that's perfectly fine. I just appreciate the feedback. Clearly here I'm in Photoshop working on the speech bubbles, and there's a nice little trick you can use in Photoshop where you can draw a shape, and shape has a very specific meaning in Photoshop. Shapes are mathematical objects until you rasterize them, and because they're these mathematical shapes, you can start a text layer above that shape, and the text will stay inside of it. And that is, as far as I know, one of the best ways to do your text bubbles. And Photoshop has pretty good text editing features. Unfortunately, what I'm working on here is off the screen, and that's in, well, here it's back, but that's an onomatopoeia. It says whoosh. Whoosh. Trying to get it to have the same angle as the speed lines coming off of the bike. I'm very very amateur at onomatopoeia and, speech bubbles and text in general. I wish I could hire somebody to do it, and maybe I will before the final product comes out. Here I'm going back into Photoshop so I can play around with this onomatopoeia a little bit more, add a border to it, a light border to help it stand out, and then I decided I would make it a little bit more transparent so it doesn't attract too much attention. Getting pretty close to the end here. Again, I really appreciate your feedback if you like this kind of video, or if you'd rather have it faster and cut out some of the more uninteresting parts. Go check out my other two previous videos. We talk about Falcon and the Winter Soldier in my most recent video. The one before that, I draw a Mandalorian for a friend. Here, the last thing I do is I got some feedback from my writer, and we decided to add a couple more speech bubbles, just so there's a little bit more of a logical transition between the last panel in the middle row and the first panel in the last row. And that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I've got links in the channel description to my Instagram and my DeviantArt, so please do find me there. Hope you guys have a great day or a great night wherever you are, and I'll see you again soon with another video. Later.